The story of housewives under the Third Reich is one of contradiction, endurance, and transformation. Between 1933 and 1945, the Nazi regime redefined womanhood through ideology, policy, and propaganda, binding it to the service of the state. In Adolf Hitler's vision of a racially pure and disciplined nation, women were not to be political actors or intellectual equals, but bearers of life and guardians of morality. Their worth was measured not in achievements or ideas, but in obedience, fertility, and domestic devotion. Kinder, Küche, Kirche, children, kitchen, church, became both slogan and sentence, reducing women's existence to a closed circle of reproduction and submission. Yet within this restrictive framework, the German housewife story is far from static. Behind the facade of cheerful domesticity crafted by Joseph Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda, millions of women experience the turbulent forces of war, scarcity, and moral collapse. They were homemakers and workers, victims and enablers, nurturers and witnesses to destruction. Their kitchens became extensions of the battlefield, their endurance a hidden pillar of the Nazi war machine. As the regime expanded its empire, these women were drawn ever deeper into the machinery of survival, mending uniforms, rationing food, and raising children under bombardment. When Germany's cities fell into ruins, it was women who cleared the rubble, rebuilt homes, and nursed the wounded. The ideal of the submissive wife dissolved into the reality of the Trümmerfrau, the rubble woman, whose labor laid the foundations of post-war recovery. Through these transformations, the German housewife's journey from obedience to independence mirrored the moral and social evolution of a nation shattered by ideology. This work traces that journey through 5 pivotal phases. From the construction of the ideal German woman in the 1930s, through the shifting roles of wartime service, to the collapse of domestic life amid total war, and finally, the emergence of resilience and autonomy in the post-war years. Each chapter explores how ordinary women navigated extraordinary times, how propaganda, fear, and necessity shaped their lives, and how, even within systems of oppression, they found moments of strength, adaptation, and survival. In 1933, when Adolf Hitler rose to power and the National Socialist German Workers' Party began transforming Germany into a totalitarian state, the vision of womanhood was one of the most rigorously redefined aspects of the new regime. The Nazi ideology revolved around the principle of Kinder, Küche, Kirche, children, kitchen, church, a triad that reduced the identity of German women to their biological and domestic functions. The ideal German woman was not to compete with men in intellectual, political, or professional fields, but to embody the purity, fertility, and obedience that would secure the racial and moral future of the nation. The propaganda of the era, masterfully constructed by Joseph Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda, cast the German woman as both the guardian of the household and the womb of the Volk. Posters, films, and speeches romanticized the simplicity of domestic life, women smiling over cradles, baking bread, or waving to soldiers. The home, not the world, was her battlefield, and her loyalty to her husband and Führer were indistinguishable. The League of German Girls, Bund Deutscher Mädel, and the National Socialist Women's League indoctrinated young girls from early adolescence. They were taught to value physical fitness, racial purity, and homemaking over education or independence. School curricula were rewritten to emphasize biology, motherhood, and racial theory, ensuring that even the youngest understood their future lay in service to family and fatherland. University opportunities for women were drastically reduced. Professions in law, medicine, and civil service were systematically closed to them. Yet to many women, the call to domesticity resonated. After years of Weimar instability, economic hardship, political chaos, and social liberation that had left many families disoriented, the Nazi ideal seemed to restore clarity and order. The government rewarded motherhood with medals such as the Cross of Honor of the German Mother and offered marriage loans that were partially forgiven for each child born. This created both a carrot and a chain, economic incentive tied to reproductive compliance. A woman's worth became measurable not by education or income, but by her ability to produce racially pure offspring. The architecture of everyday life was redesigned to reflect this new order. Public housing projects emphasized functional kitchens. Women's magazines extolled the virtues of self-sufficiency, modesty, and devotion. The home became both sanctuary and surveillance site, a place where ideology was enacted daily through cooking, cleaning, and child-rearing. Radio broadcasts encouraged mothers to instill discipline and loyalty in their children. Even lullabies were infused with nationalist imagery. The Nazi state sought not only to control the physical body of the German woman, but her consciousness, turning motherhood into a political act. However, the idealization of the domestic sphere masked a profound contradiction. While the regime exalted the role of housewives, its industrial ambitions and rearmament plans required increasing female labor. Thus, by the late 1930s, women were quietly reabsorbed into the workforce, particularly in textile and administrative sectors, though propaganda continued to stress that this was a temporary necessity. This duality of glorifying domesticity while exploiting labor would define much of the Nazi gender policy throughout the decade. In private, many women struggled between pride in fulfilling their duty and a quiet yearning for intellectual and personal freedom. Diaries and letters from the period reveal ambivalence, satisfaction in motherhood tempered by isolation, admiration for national renewal overshadowed by moral discomfort. Yet dissent was dangerous. The Gestapo watched not only public activists, but those whose behavior strayed from the prescribed norms of femininity. To reject motherhood or marriage was to defy the racial destiny of the Reich. Even contraception was discouraged, and abortion criminalized except for the purposes of racial hygiene. The result was a population of women bound by invisible chains of ideology, their identities confined to the rhythm of domestic rituals. Still, within these confines, some found quiet strength. The act of homemaking became a form of endurance, a small assertion of stability in a nation obsessed with control. The 1930s German housewife, framed as both servant and symbol, navigated a narrow corridor of expectation, praised for her submission, yet vital to the Nazi dream of eternal order. As Europe edged toward war, her carefully constructed world of kitchens and cradles would soon face an upheaval that no amount of propaganda could contain. Her duty to the home would soon expand into duty to survival. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, and the world was thrust into war once more, the role of the German housewife shifted from domestic duty to wartime endurance. The same propaganda that had exalted her as the guardian of hearth and home now recast her as a soldier of the home front, whose weapon was endurance and whose battlefield was the kitchen, the ration line, and the munitions factory. As men marched to the front, women were urged to maintain the illusion of normalcy, to preserve the heart of the Reich while the world burned. In speeches, posters, and radio broadcasts, the Nazi regime presented the war as a collective family struggle, one that required every German to sacrifice personal comfort for the sake of the nation. The home, once a symbol of stability, became a site of mobilization, Housewives were taught to make do with less, to stretch rations creatively, to sew and mend rather than buy new clothes, and to transform scarcity into virtue. The Eintopfsonntag, or one-pot Sunday meal, became a patriotic ritual. By cooking a single simple dish, women symbolically contributed to the war effort. Each spoonful of stew became a declaration of loyalty. Domestic propaganda equated frugality with heroism, urging women to find pride in sacrifice. Yet behind the rhetoric of unity lay anxiety and exhaustion. As bombing raids increased and supply chains strained, housewives bore the weight of a collapsing economy. They queued for hours for bread and butter, often returning home empty-handed. Gasoline and electricity shortages turned everyday chores into struggles. Still, they persevered, driven by habit, fear, and the lingering belief in Hitler's promises of victory. The Nazi leadership had entered the war with a paradox. It needed total mobilization, but refused to fully acknowledge the necessity of women's industrial labor, fearing it would undermine the patriarchal ideals at the heart of the ideology. Women were initially excluded from direct combat-related industries and instead encouraged to volunteer in community kitchens, hospitals, and welfare organizations. Magda Goebbels, the First Lady of the Reich, became a symbolic mother figure, addressing women through radio broadcasts about sacrifice, faith, and the sanctity of motherhood in wartime. Her voice, calm and commanding, told them that endurance was their noblest contribution. To complain, to despair, was to betray the nation's morale. Yet as the war expanded across Europe, the demand for labor became impossible to ignore. By late 1940, women were quietly conscripted into auxiliary roles: clerks, typists, factory workers, and agricultural laborers. The Reich's vision of womanhood was being rewritten by necessity, even as propaganda continued to project the image of the serene homemaker tending her family while her husband fought abroad. This dual image, maternal angel and silent laborer, defined the female experience of early wartime Germany. In cities like Berlin, Munich, and Hamburg, the air raid siren became as familiar as the church bell. Housewives learned to carry gas masks while grocery shopping, to black out windows at dusk, and to calm children as anti-aircraft guns roared overhead. Their world shrank to basements and shelters, where whispered prayers mingled with the sounds of falling bombs. In rural areas, women took on the work of absent men, plowing fields, harvesting crops, maintaining livestock, while also caring for children and the elderly. The Reich food estate issued manuals instructing women how to preserve food, combat pests, and store fuel efficiently. Domestic science became wartime strategy. The idea of home transformed. It was no longer a private refuge, but a microcosm of the nation's endurance. Every tidy kitchen, every well-fed child was presented as proof of Germany's moral superiority over its enemies. Yet the emotional cost of this illusion was immense. Letters from soldiers at the front spoke of glory and sacrifice, but those left behind faced a quieter, more ambiguous struggle, a war of waiting, of maintaining appearances, of holding families together as the world disintegrated. Many women lost contact with their husbands for months. Telegrams of death or disappearance arrived without warning. Widows and single mothers became increasingly common, though the regime discouraged public mourning, fearing it would weaken national spirit. Instead, grief was to be channeled into productive work or volunteer service. The Nazi concept of the ideal woman evolved under pressure. The strong, stoic mother replaced the delicate domestic angel of the 1930s. Women were now praised for their toughness, their ability to endure sleepless nights, shortages, and fear without complaint. Posters depicted women with sleeves rolled up, hair tied back, standing beside soldiers or tractors, a sanitized image of shared struggle. But beneath the surface, the contradiction deepened. The same regime that demanded obedience also relied on the silent rebellion of female resourcefulness. Housewives found ways to barter, to cheat ration cards, to cultivate small gardens behind bombed buildings. They became the unsung logisticians of survival, maintaining the domestic infrastructure upon which the war machine depended. While men fought with rifles, women fought with ration books, spoons, and endurance. By 1941, as Operation Barbarossa opened the Eastern Front, the strain on civilian life reached new heights. Letters from soldiers at the front described unimaginable brutality. Rumors of atrocities filtered back, though few dared to speak of them openly. Within Germany, propaganda intensified, urging women to give everything, to send their sons, their husbands, even their household silver for the war effort. The moral rhetoric of sacrifice hardened into fatalism. Yet among the women themselves, quiet networks of solidarity emerged. Neighbors shared food, watched each other's children, and whispered their doubts behind curtains. In these moments, the German housewife ceased to be merely a symbol of obedience and became an agent of endurance. Her role had shifted irrevocably. No longer confined by the narrow domestic ideology of the 1930s, she was now both a victim and participant in the machinery of total war. Her kitchen was a command post, her silence a form of survival. The years 1939 to 1941 thus mark a transformation not only in Germany's war fortunes, but in the soul of its women. They had entered the conflict as guardians of domestic order and emerged as the invisible backbone of a nation at war, carrying the weight of its ambitions and its despair on their weary shoulders. By 1941, as Germany launched its invasion of the Soviet Union and the Second World War reached its brutal zenith, the life of the German housewife had been utterly transformed. The illusion of order that had defined the early years of the war was beginning to crumble beneath the weight of exhaustion, deprivation, and grief. The same propaganda that once promised victory and security now demanded unending sacrifice. The slogan, Totaler Krieg, Kurze Sister Krieg, total war for the shortest war, became a rallying cry, but for women on the home front, total war meant total subjugation of their bodies, time, and spirit to the demands of the Reich. The boundaries between the private and the political dissolved completely. The kitchen, once a sanctuary, became a production site. Every meal was a logistical battle fought against ration cards and scarcity. The Nazi regime, unwilling to admit that its patriarchal ideal of womanhood was collapsing under wartime necessity, continued to glorify domesticity even as it mobilized women in unprecedented numbers. By 1942, women made up over half of Germany's workforce, taking on roles once deemed unsuitable for their sex, working in munitions factories, railways, agriculture, and civil administration. The contradiction was striking. While propaganda films still depicted the smiling mother waving goodbye to her soldier husband, in reality, she was likely operating machinery, repairing bomb damage, or driving supply trucks. The ideal of the serene homemaker was replaced by the image of the stoic survivor. Yet the regime's rhetoric did not evolve to match this reality. Joseph Goebbels' propaganda continued to insist that women's work outside the home was merely a temporary measure, a patriotic extension of their natural domestic role. To question this narrative was considered disloyal, even treasonous. Still, among themselves, women began to recognize their growing indispensability. They were holding the nation together while men died at the front. This awareness, though rarely spoken, marked a subtle psychological rebellion. In the cities, air raids became part of daily life. Bombs shattered not only buildings, but the myth of the invincible Reich. Housewives learned to navigate the ruins, salvaging bricks, patching roofs, and transforming cellars into living quarters. Children were evacuated to rural areas under the Kinderlandverschicking program, leaving mothers in emotional limbo, torn between relief for their safety and anguish at separation. Women's letters from the period reveal an undercurrent of loneliness and dread, yet also an astonishing capacity for adaptation. They became experts in improvisation, making coffee from roasted barley, soap from animal fat, clothing from curtains. Scarcity bred ingenuity, and within that ingenuity lay both defiance and despair. The domestic sphere became a paradoxical site of oppression and resistance. While the state sought to control every aspect of life, the home remained one of the few spaces where individual agency could quietly persist. Women manipulated ration systems, forged food stamps, and engaged in small acts of barter that defied state control. These were not political rebellions, but they were acts of survival. And survival in a regime that valued obedience above all was its own form of dissent. The years 1941 to 1943 also brought the new moral weight to the lives of ordinary housewives. As news of atrocities in the East began to trickle back, often through letters and gossip from returning soldiers, a grim awareness spread through the population. Many did not speak of what they suspected, but silence itself became a form of complicity. Housewives who once proudly stitched swastika flags now avoided political talk, whispering their doubts in kitchens and cellars. They were witnesses to a nation's descent into barbarity, yet trapped within it, unable or unwilling to resist openly. Religion, once suppressed by Nazi ideology, regained quiet significance for some. Churches became spaces of solace, their hymns mingling with the distant echo of sirens. For others, faith shifted inward, a belief not in divine salvation, but in the endurance of the human spirit. Mothers clung to routine as a means of preserving sanity, reciting bedtime prayers over candlelight even as the world outside turned to rubble. At the same time, the regime intensified its expectations of women. The German woman was now expected to embody both sacrifice and strength, tenderness and toughness. She was to be uncomplaining, industrious, and infinitely loyal. This impossible ideal mirrored the larger contradictions of the Nazi state, demanding purity while fostering violence, glorifying motherhood while destroying families. Even as the war front consumed millions of men, the home front demanded its own casualties. Malnutrition, exhaustion, and mental breakdowns became common. Women collapsed in factories, fainted in ration lines, or succumbed to despair in bomb shelters. Yet the official narrative allowed no room for weakness. Magazines like Frau im Reich continued to publish articles on the virtues of cheerful resilience, accompanied by photographs of fresh-faced women baking bread in spotless kitchens that no longer existed. This propaganda served not only to deceive, but to isolate. It made each woman believe her suffering was unique, her exhaustion a personal failing rather than a collective condition. Still, within this shared hardship, bonds of solidarity emerged. Women formed informal networks to share food, childcare, and information. They became each other's confidants, nurses, and protectors. These connections, built in the shadows of fear, were fragile yet profound. They represented a quiet resistance to the atomization of society. The Nazi vision of community, Volksgemeinschaft, was meant to unite the people under ideology, but what truly united women were the realities of hunger, loss, and survival. By 1944, the facade of control and order that had once characterized life under the Third Reich lay in ruins. The tide of war had turned irrevocably against Germany, and the women who had long been told that their place was in the home found themselves standing amid its literal destruction. The Allied bombing campaigns reduced cities like Berlin, Hamburg, and Dresden to smoldering wastelands, and the once prized symbol of the German domestic ideal, the tidy, efficient household, became an impossible dream. The air raid sirens replaced the church bells of old, marking not the beginning of a workday or a holy service, but the approach of death from above. For housewives, survival became a full-time occupation. They carried water through rebel-strewn streets, scavenged for food among ruins, and learned to distinguish the whistle of falling bombs by instinct. The idea of domesticity as duty, once glorified by the Nazi regime, had devolved into domesticity as desperation. The home was no longer a place of rest or moral renewal. It was a shelter, a tomb, and a site of mourning. The rhythmic order of household routines, cooking, cleaning, child-rearing, was shattered by chaos. Gas, electricity, and water were intermittent. Ration cards nearly useless, and bread made of sawdust became a grim reality. Yet even as everything collapsed, the burden of maintaining some semblance of normalcy fell squarely on women's shoulders. They were expected to feed families without food, to comfort children while burying neighbors, to maintain faith when the state's promises dissolved into smoke. The contradictions of Nazi gender ideology reached their breaking point. The regime that had once idealized women as nurturers and homemakers now demanded from them the endurance of soldiers. In 1944, Goebbels called for total war, insisting that every citizen, male or female, must give their all. Posters exhorted women to join the war effort, to work in factories, to dig trenches, to nurse the wounded. The boundaries of femininity were redrawn by fire and necessity. Women donned work uniforms, operated anti-aircraft guns, and drove military vehicles, even as official rhetoric continued to speak of their sacred duties as mothers. Propaganda images showed women smiling in bombed-out kitchens, cradling infants while flames rose in the distance, the embodiment of stoic endurance. But behind those images was exhaustion beyond measure. Letters from the period describe sleepless nights in basements, days spent queuing for food, and the unending dread of air raids. Mothers soothed terrified children with songs as the world above them burned. Elderly women who could no longer flee the bombings sat motionless in shelters, clutching family photos to their chests. The illusion of national unity, once so powerfully propagated, disintegrated amid hunger and fear. Neighbors turned on each other for scraps of food. Informants still whispered to the Gestapo, even as the state itself crumbled. The moral landscape of Germany was collapsing as completely as its physical one. By the winter of 1944, the Eastern Front had become a nightmare that seeped into every German home. Rumors of the advancing Red Army, its vengeance for years of Nazi brutality, spread panic among women. In towns and villages across East Prussia, Silesia, and Pomerania, civilians fled in desperate columns, dragging children and meager possessions through snow and mud. For many women, the retreat became an ordeal of unimaginable suffering. They endured cold, hunger, disease, and violence. Rape and assault by invading soldiers became widespread, shattering both bodies and spirits. In diaries and testimonies, women later described this period not as liberation, but as apocalypse. The world they had been told to preserve, the family, the home, the moral order, was annihilated. The patriarchal structure that had defined Nazi society disintegrated under the weight of loss. With husbands dead or missing, sons captured or buried in distant fields, women became the sole anchors of survival. Their previous obedience to the regime meant nothing. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, Germany lay in ruins, not only its cities and infrastructure, but its moral and social foundations. The ideology that had once exalted women as symbols of purity and obedience had collapsed with the Reich itself. In its wake stood millions of women who had endured unspeakable hardship, loss, and humiliation, yet whose resilience would come to define the nation's rebirth. The German housewife, once confined to the narrow domestic ideal of Kinder, Küche, Kirche, emerged from the rubble transformed by necessity and experience. The post-war years marked not an immediate liberation, but a painful process of reckoning. Women faced the double burden of physical survival and moral awakening, forced to reconcile their participation in or silence during the atrocities of the Nazi regime with the need to rebuild their families and communities. The first months after capitulation were characterized by chaos, hunger, and occupation. The victorious Allies divided Germany into zones, and the population faced acute shortages of food, fuel, and shelter. The term Trümmerfrau, or rubble woman, entered the national lexicon, referring to the countless women who took up shovels and cleared the ruins of bombed cities brick by brick. They became the literal builders of a new Germany, their labor both symbolic and essential. Photographs of women standing amidst debris, faces smeared with dust yet eyes filled with grim determination, replaced the sanitized images of domestic bliss once promoted by Nazi propaganda. For the first time, the female body was no longer idealized as an emblem of fertility or purity, but recognized as a vessel of endurance and strength. Yet the transformation was not immediate or uniform. Many women, traumatized and disoriented, clung to familiar roles as homemakers, seeing in domestic order a refuge from the moral chaos outside. Cooking a meal, mending clothes, and sweeping a floor became acts of defiance against despair, a way to restore dignity and control. Others, especially widows and displaced persons, had no choice but to become breadwinners. The absence of men, killed, missing, or imprisoned, forced them into economic independence. They took jobs as cleaners, secretaries, farmers, and factory workers, often for meager pay and under harsh conditions. But through this necessity, they discovered agency. The very women who had been told that their place was in the home now found themselves managing budgets, negotiating with occupation authorities, and making decisions that once would have belonged to husbands or fathers. The gender hierarchy that had underpinned Nazi ideology was irreparably fractured. In the early post-war years, survival trumped ideology. The lines between political guilt and victimhood blurred. Many women denied knowledge of the regime's crimes, insisting they had been mere housewives, apolitical and obedient. Yet their silence during the war and their complicity in sustaining the system of everyday life under Nazism haunted the national conscience. Historians later termed this phenomenon the moral gray zone, a space where ordinary people became both perpetrators and victims. For many women, confronting this truth was unbearable. Instead, they focused on rebuilding, on feeding children, repairing homes, and finding lost relatives. The domestic sphere, once politicized by the Nazis, was reclaimed as a space of apolitical survival. But beneath the surface of everyday routines, a subtle social revolution was taking place. The experience of the war had fundamentally altered women's relationship to authority. They had witnessed the failure of patriarchal leadership, fathers, husbands, and the Führer himself, and learned that obedience could lead to catastrophe. This realization, though rarely articulated, became a quiet rebellion that shaped the moral texture of post-war society. In the West, under Allied occupation, women became crucial to the democratization process. They staffed municipal offices, organized food cooperatives, and participated in local politics. Women's organizations re-emerged, many of them focusing on social welfare, children's education, and reconciliation. Though most of their efforts were practical rather than overtly feminist, they laid the groundwork for later movements. In East Germany, under Soviet control, the state promoted women's labor participation as part of its socialist ideology, granting formal equality even as traditional burdens persisted. Thus, across both halves of the divided nation, the figure of the housewife evolved into something new: the working mother, the citizen, the survivor. Yet the emotional legacy of the war endured. The trauma of loss and violence lingered in silence within families. Mothers avoided discussing the past, hoping to shield their children from its horrors. But this silence bred unease, a generational tension that would erupt decades later when post-war youth began to question their parents' complicity in Nazi crimes. For many women, guilt intertwined with grief. They mourned husbands who had died for a false cause, sons lost on foreign soil, and the moral corruption of the society they had helped sustain. Yet within that mourning lay the first seeds of moral clarity. The post-war years demanded not only physical reconstruction, but spiritual renewal. Churches once again became centers of solace and reflection. Women filled the pews, seeking forgiveness and strength. But faith, too, had changed. It was less about obedience to authority and more about personal responsibility. Women who had once prayed for victory now prayed for peace. The concept of duty itself underwent transformation. No longer tied to ideology or male authority, it became rooted in compassion, family, and community. By the 1950s, the Wirtschaftswunder, or economic miracle, brought material comfort to West Germany, but it also risked reinstating traditional gender norms. Advertising once again portrayed the cheerful housewife, now surrounded by modern appliances instead of Nazi slogans. The new domestic ideal was apolitical, but still restrictive. Many women who had tasted independence during and after the war found themselves confined again by the expectations of post-war conservatism. Yet the memory of hardship lingered. Beneath the polished surfaces of post-war prosperity, the resilience and self-sufficiency forged in the ruins persisted. It was these women, the quiet builders, the survivors, who laid the foundation for the feminist awakening of the 1960s and 1970s.